I know, this would have been more useful a couple of days ago. My apologies. Let's just blame everything on COVID, as we should. That did not occur to me to provide you with this example earlier. But either way, I know this could help a lot of you. You're welcome to go back and redo and resubmit should you so choose to do so. But here is an example of how to find DIDLS and complete the assignments you've been given for these short stories. I chose the lottery for the short story so that you can practice this on the other ones on your own. I'm gonna have to hit the desk here in a second to keep the lights on. So sorry about that. That might happen more than once. Okay, so for the short stories, let's say that I downloaded that one that we were just looking at off of Canvas, which is what it looks like, right? When you choose your assignment, it's always in here with a link that you then copy and the PDF of the story. Okay, so I've got my PDF of the story, my chart that I fill out for each one, and then what I do first is I read the story. So I just straight up read the story first. I don't necessarily look for anything. Like, you can if you want to, if that works for you, but generally I like to know what the story is about first so I can see if there's language or details that are actually more important than others. So I read the story first. So let's say I went through and read the story. I then go back and look for DIDLS, is how I say that, the DIDLS. And I mean, you can see it there, but I go through and I annotate using colors because color coding works well for me. If you didn't print it out and you just find them as you go along to put on that chart, that's totally fine with me. You can do that if you so choose. But it helps me to see visually what those DIDLS are. So if I just start reading this story, The Lottery, the morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. An issue I've seen for some of you is that because DIDLS, like sentences, phrases, the words, the punctuation might function in more than one way, you're getting a little bit caught up with that and not sure what to call it. You can call it more than one thing. So if we look at this first sentence here, not only is it imagery, it's also diction, to use the words profusely, richly. That even adds to language. It makes it ornate. I didn't write that here, but it does. Profusely, richly, boisterous, jovial. We've got these different words that give the writing itself a very formal, I did write that over here because that's for, oh gosh, now I can't remember, language for the audience. Oh boy. Anyway, you can look at the examples. Formal is one of them and ornate is the other type. If you can't distinguish perfectly between the two, that's fine. If you can distinguish that it's language being used to create some type of mood, I don't mind which of those boxes it's in, whether it's in the language for the audience or language for the atmosphere. Don't get hung up on that. I'm not that worried about it. If you can identify what the language is for, it's got the examples in here, right? Like I said, ornate would fit in the language for atmosphere. There you go. So we could write those examples in here. So if we keep reading, I'm going to skip down so you don't have to watch this video forever. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. This, to say, and the children even, instead of the kids assembled first, makes it a more formal tone. So just keep that in mind. Feeling at liberty, not feeling freedom, right? To choose at liberty makes a difference. And already we've got words like uneasy, which you could circle that for a detail as well if you've read it. And if any of you know what the lottery is about, there is an ominous tone that's going on throughout. The atmosphere that's being created for the reader is one of discomfort and like, you know, something bad seems to be coming, but it sounds so mundane that it's in the writing. This Shirley Jackson was able to like creep us out so well when things she's saying don't seem like that big of a deal, right? It says they tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Okay, so there's nothing much in that, like kids are gathering rocks, but we we should question, like, why are they gathering these rocks, right? She tells us how to pronounce the name, gives us that detail. If we come down a little bit further, we've got an example of syntax here. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. To have this sentence that is broken up just by these commas that like keeps going on like that with like different ideas, right? One's about surveying his children. The other one's talking to the people around him about very mundane things for this village, right? Planting, rain, tractors, taxes, whatever. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corners, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. So that's something that I underlined for a detail. What's preventing them from laughing? Again, this detail makes it feel ominous, which could be part of language. It's also a detail. So like the overlap here happens a lot. That's what a good writer does. They're using more than one of these narrative techniques while writing because it makes it much more interesting to read it that way. So again, you can count that as whatever thing you want to use it as and whatever you feel like you can explain the best. The women wearing faded house dresses and sweaters. So to me, I can picture that, so I consider it to be imagery. Came shortly after their menfolk. So to have a word like menfolk, I used this as language, but it could also be diction. That word choice there makes it sound like it's another world, that they're from a different time or a different place. And as you keep reading, we find out that this is a dystopian society. It's not like, you know, downtown Salt Lake. All right, let's skip ahead a little bit more. It says his father spoke up sharply and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The sentence before this says that his mother kept trying to get him to come back and he wouldn't, and this detail tells us that it's a patriarchal society. So that just informs us of something that they didn't have to tell us. They didn't say, this is a patriarchal society. Instead, it's the detail, this sentence, to tell us that his father spoke up sharply and the kid came running. We know that his father is considered in charge and he followed immediately. We've got some imagery here. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business. So we've got imagery plus diction. And then they talk about when they arrived in the square that this man was carrying, and it's funny, his name is Mr. Summers, this very like happy sort of name, right? Was carrying a black wooden box. And like, why does this box matter to all of these people? It seems like a big deal. And then the postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him carrying a three-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. So it's clearly like a thing. They've set up this box. It's sitting in the middle of the square. That's also imagery. You could underline that as we were meant to like envision this sitting in the middle of the square with all 300 inhabitants of this village there to see it. So it's a big deal. It matters. And his name being Mr. Graves, in contrast to Mr. Summers, is interesting. So like an ominous feeling comes from that name, Mr. Graves. If we come down here, it says the original paraphernalia. Again, kind of a clinical sounding description. So the mood becomes rather like even more eerie. It's just adding to that, right? It even, okay, I didn't think that this was a rite of passage story. Turns out it actually is. And who knows, maybe we'll read it, but maybe not. But it talks about the ritual that they use in order to go through like all the different steps of the lottery. So in this town, this lottery is a rite of passage that they go through together, that they've all agreed upon as a society. Okay, this video is getting quite long. So these are the examples that I would use, that I would then transcribe over to this form over here. So this one asks me to have one example per, so I would type up my quotes. Remember I said you could use ellipses so that you don't have to do the whole thing. Clear and sunny with the fresh warmth. Of a full summer day. Okay, I would put that whole sentences, but again, I don't want you to wait forever. And then the purpose. So diction, what words were used and why were they used? Oh, I put that in the wrong one. That's supposed to be an imagery. My bad. I'm doing so good at this assignment so far. Okay, So then it asks us why this particular imagery was used. And then you would explain over here in this one. We picture this like lovely little village, right? Like very sweet. I would actually love if this asked me for more than one, because then we could choose another example of where the town doesn't sound quite so sweet anymore, because there is a significant change in the town. So like what images were used, what senses are summoned, we can visualize this, we can smell those flowers, things like that. And then the purpose being a contrast of this like very sweet village. And then I don't want to ruin the story for you, but the dark thing that takes place in this very sweet village is what I would explain in this box over here. And I would go into some detail about that, right? And then same thing for all of these. Oh, we don't need these ones for this particular story. But that's what you do, right? And then at the end, we would explain the rite of passage in this story, which again, I won't make you wait for, because, oh my gosh, we're already at almost 12 minutes. So that's how I would go about doing it. If you've been doing it differently, you found a different way, don't feel like this is the only way, but this is one way that you can do it, and hopefully seeing it visually like this is helpful for some of you. Let me know if you have any questions.